Welcome back. Let's pick up where we left off from the first segment in looking at strategic planning. And let's spend some time looking at where you get your sources of information to help you, regardless of the approach that you decide to take. Now, information is the fuel, regardless of the planning approach that you take. And each and every one of them is designed to provide you with some perspective about the world around you, kind of where things are now, where they've been, where they seem to be going, as well as looking internally and looking at, what have you done in the past? What could you do that you're not doing now? Aspects like that, because when you bring all of those various different pieces together, regardless of the planning approach that you take, these are the kinds of things that help you understand where your opportunities lay, and where you can make the best use of the organizational strengths or changes in the world around you. So part is kind of market forces, right? Because for something to be successful, it's got to be an effective fit to the economic environment. And the environment will change from time to time. It will be different in one region from another. Certainly, even from one city to another, you can have some differences. There are some businesses that even the specific location, right, whether you're on one side of the street or the other, can make a fairly significant difference to the kind of success that you have. From a market forces standpoint, there's a couple of things. So one of them is kind of broader picture stuff. So this is the like Stats Canada information and things like that, where it's more about patterns that have changed over time and the direction those changes seem to be taken. Right. So I've given an example before. I mean, historically, the largest single household demographic in Canada was basically families, right? So it was, a mom and dad and some kids. I think it was 2.2 or 2.3 or whatever the number is. Um, and in the not too, a distant past, that changed. And now the numerically largest single demographic is single person households. And that shift has been coming for a long, long time, and there's nothing to indicate that it's likely to change. Yet that's a fairly significant change to almost every business that would operate in Canada, right? If you're selling anything retail, there's a good chance you're packaging it in the wrong way. Um, if you're building things for people's homes, they may not be sized appropriately. If you're building homes, they may not be the right size. No, it doesn't mean that the family home has gone away and that stuff has disappeared. Um, but the changes are not really all that subtle, and they will have fairly significant effects. Within any specific industry, you would also be looking at those same kinds of trends. So what has been, what is now, what kind of changes do we see happening in this specific industry? And some of it has to do with the participants, and are there more of them? Are there fewer of them? Are they tending to consolidate, right? Which is pretty common actually in mature industries. You usually end up with a fairly small number of players that are larger, just because of the dynamics of where you are in the product life cycle. But stuff like that, right? So that's kind of like a 10,000 foot, if you will, a viewpoint of things. But it's a really, really important perspective, both of the overall economy and in the region that you're specifically looking at, as well as within the industries themselves. And each industry has their own kind of challenges and their own kind of opportunities. And you gather information like this from government sources like StatsCan, right? Traditional media sources, industry groups and publications. So almost every industry of any size has its own association. They usually have their own trade shows. They often do their own research, and stuff like that is quite helpful. Trade shows in particular, it's a gathering where basically you have a microcosm of the entire industry in the same place. So, the 2 or 3 days that you spend at that trade show is an opportunity to see kind of what your competitors are doing, what other stuff is happening in the spaces. Any of the major customers are usually there as well. So they're fairly important venues in any one particular industry. Your customers or suppliers, right, are very good sources of information. Customers certainly for the kinds of things and the kinds of changes that are happening in their world that you perhaps can respond to, which provide opportunities for you. Changes that suppliers that support you have in technologies or things that are available, which would allow you to do different things than you do today. Any players in your industry that are public companies, so basically their ownership is traded on a stock exchange somewhere, they have to report annual financial results. So their financial results and their publications are a good source of information to see what they're doing and kind of where they've been. And usually if you're of a size that you're being publicly traded, you're a reasonably significant player. And that can be quite illuminating. I mentioned some of the general marketplace, kind of roughly, but things like, government subsidies or changes to government subsidies. In Canada, we've had one to encourage the purchase of new electric vehicles. One of the largest sources of greenhouse emissions is from the transportation sector. And if we can get fuel, like particularly gasoline burning vehicles, off the road in favor of other clean sources, of which electric is one today, then that's a good thing. So lots of levels of government do things to try to encourage that to happen. And one of the challenges that they're trying to overcome is that all things being equal, the equivalent vehicle as an electric versus an internal combustion is actually about between $8,000 and $10,000 more money, just because of the technology required for it. It largely comes down to the batteries. The battery is a fairly expensive component. And although you don't have anywhere near the number of moving parts and things like that that you have in the internal combustion engine, they're still, today, they're more money. So the subsidy is designed to try to help offset that. Well, depending on where you are in the country, the subsidy is different because in large part it's provincially funded. Ontario used to have a pretty good one. When the PCs were elected in provincially, they got rid of it. So if you were in the business of selling, supporting, any of that other stuff, overnight, the circumstances of your ability to be successful changed pretty dramatically. Because all of a sudden, the new vehicles went up effectively $8,000 or $10,000 now. So it had a serious effect on curtailing not all of the industry, because the subsidies were never designed to go to the upper end. So I'm not sure how much of an impact it had on Tesla, because Tesla wasn't really covered to begin with. So there was probably negligible, if any, effect. I don't know whether potentially the Model 3 might have been eligible. I guess it depended on what configuration, but the other models definitely weren't. So it probably didn't have the effect on it than it did for Nissan or Kia or any of the others, which is really where they were targeting the subsidy to go towards, to try to help that. Same thing you get with trade restrictions or tariffs, which often happen as the result of political things, yet those political things have very significant, or can have very significant economic effects that you, as somebody in that industry, can often do absolutely nothing about other than try to find a way to ride it out. Changes to monetary exchange rates, right? So each currency has a value pegged to each other. Ultimately today, they're all pegged to the US dollar. That's kind of the reserve currency of the world at the moment. And the value of one currency versus another is a fairly complicated set of interrelated pieces that kind of set those rates. But the net effect is, if I export predominantly, if my dollar is worth less than the dollar of the country that I'm exporting to, that makes my goods relatively cheaper, which is historically Canada has traditionally tried to manage its dollar so that we're, call it 75 cents to 80 cents US. And that's purposely managed that way. So what happens is Canadian exporters to the US, which has traditionally been the largest market that Canadian producers have, that makes our products relatively cheaper to American consumers. Now, the reverse is for any things that you import into Canada, particularly again from the US, it makes it relatively more expensive. So historically, it makes lots of consumer goods more expensive for most Canadian consumers. However, it gives an edge to Canadian producers that export to the US. Oil, lumber, aluminum, like all kinds of things like that there's a significant advantage. And I mean, part of the role of the government of the day and the Bank of Canada is to kind of balance off all the interests to try to find kind of the best place to end up with a value. And then at the end of the day, there's lots of things that happen globally that will have an effect on what your dollar is actually worth. Social concerns, demographic or political changes, actually we're kind of living through one right now, right? So this is, the whole pandemic and the reactions to it have had life-changing effects on everybody. And everybody has been affected by it in numerous ways, right? Both in how we live. It could well have affected your job or your ability to have one. It could have definitely affected income. It could have affected expenses. Like there's all kinds of things. That creates opportunities. It also creates challenges as well. Inflation, deflation, or any changes in the lending rates. I won't spend a ton of time. I can go kind of deep in this stuff. So inflation, strictly speaking, is an increase in the money supply. Deflation is the opposite. It's most commonly talked about in rising prices versus, and one of the offshoots of rising prices is that usually your wages, relatively speaking, are worth less as time goes on, because it's the real purchasing power doesn't usually keep up with it. Changes in lending rate can be pretty significant, particularly if what you do is something that's financed. So if you sell vehicles, for example, almost nobody buys one outright with cash. There are people that do, but most don't. Most either lease or they buy over so many months. And either of those two ways, the lending rate has a very significant impact on the cost to do that. And that can dramatically change what people decide to do and if they decide to do it. It's one of the reasons why if you look at every car manufacturer has their own finance branch, and they very regularly offer incentives that are completely out of whack with what the actual prime lending rate is, right? So they'll do, 0% for, up to 84 months, which is substantially below. I mean, even with the low interest rates that are out there now, that's still undercutting it. And they do it on purpose, right? Because they understand that's a very significant incentive, and it's a big piece of their ability to be successful, selling new vehicles. And by them having their own financial arm, it gives them the ability to capture some more business, but also at the same time do things to support the core new car business. The markets that you're in, are they expanding? Are they stable? Are they contracting? All of those circumstances would give you different opportunities in front of you. Some general issues, is the capacity in your industry versus market demand? Is it stable? Is there more capacity than demand, which means most people are probably not very profitable? Is there more demand than capacity? We've seen that short term now with PPE, right? So there's more market demand than current capacity for producing masks and gloves and so on and so forth, right? So these are opportunity times for people that are in that business or people who can pivot to be into that business. Do you see mergers and acquisitions, which are really common in industries as they mature? Where you are in the life cycle of your product or service, because your margin structures your competitive view, how many customers, that you're likely to be able to sell to, what your growth rates might look like. All of those things are very different depending on where you are in the life cycle. And those attributes change over time, and those changes mean there's things that you can do perhaps tomorrow that you couldn't have done today, and there's some things that you could do today that you won't get away with doing tomorrow. Potential entry of a new or less expensive product or service, which can basically transform or remove your industry, right? So when the automobile came on, not only did it get rid of basically people who made, horse buggies, but if you made like buggy whips and stuff like that for them, it pretty much dramatically changed your business. So you are now going to be a niche play at best, unless you pivoted to, do other things in the leather goods space that wasn't going to be replaced by the automobile coming on. What's the speed of or the rate of change in the industry that you're in? Most of them are much faster today than they used to be. Some are very, very quick, right? A lot of tech is very, very quick. Level of regulation in your industry, and probably more importantly, how is that changing and how is that likely to change in the future? Is it going to become more? Is it going to become less? Is it going to become relatively the same? Is there specialized knowledge required in your industry? If there is, particularly with your employees, that can be a potential challenge for growth, because how do you tap into these skill sets or these people with that specialized knowledge? Relative bargaining power of customers, which has a lot to do usually with how many customers you sell to. If you sell to Walmart and they're the only one you sell to, guess what? Effectively, they're going to call the shots to you. If you sell to a broader assortment of customers, no one customer has significant leverage over what you're doing. And then finally, if your business is one that intellectual property supports or patents are an important piece of it, when those patents expire, that will transform how you could sell that particular product, right? So when a patent expires from a medicine, all of a sudden any of the generic producers can produce it for what the components costs are, plus some margin for distribution and for them to make some profit or whatever. But it's substantially less than what the name brand stuff had been selling for, because part of what the name brand stuff had been selling for also carried with it the ability to recoup the many, many millions of dollars that they had invested in research and development to develop that medicine, to do all of the various different trials and things like that. So it was a way to get that money back and a return on that money back. But once the patent is gone, all of a sudden it's open season, right? Another thing you're going to want to look at is your competitors. And there's two aspects particularly. So one of them is kind of a soup to nuts, everything about them. So who are they? Where are they? How big are they? Are they growing? What kinds of things are they doing? What are they good at? What are they not good at? It's kind of a very holistic view. And often what you'll do is you'll actually map out the competitive landscape. And often some of the best options in your planning cycle is to pick a space that isn't occupied by somebody else, because that gives you an ability to grow into a space without necessarily somebody else having to lose. Picking a strategy that's, for me to win, you have to lose. First of all, it's riskier than you normally need to take. Second of all, it doesn't do anybody any service, because it's a net zero kind of supposition. You just get it at somebody else's expense. Whereas in most places and in most situations, there's an opportunity to service a part of the market that's not being adequately serviced today. And then that brings value to the marketplace overall. The other aspect that you'd look at is this concept of benchmarking. So benchmarking is looking at specific kind of measurements, if you will, that are important to your customers. And it's important in any of these things that you benchmark to that you are competitive with your results. So I'll give you an example. If you're a fast food restaurant, the time it takes for you to take an order and fulfill it, like through the drive-through, would be an important metric for your customers. And if on average let's say it's 2 minutes and 30 seconds, I'm not saying you have to be 2 minutes and 30 seconds, but if you are the same kind of operation, serve, similar levels of food, kind of similar price point, everything else, yeah, you kind of have to be. And in fact, if anything, if you're better than that, it's a potential competitive advantage. Um, if you're a higher end restaurant, the time for you to turn around and an order from a table and going back out is longer, and people understand that it is because they understand it's a different part of the experience. If you're a value option in your market space, part of the reason your value might be because you're not necessarily as fast. Think of postal services, right? So as you pay more to send a package, you get other things with it. You get insurance, you get tracking, you get stuff like that. But one of the core things that happens is the speed of the service increases. So if I'm the economy shipping option, I'm not supposed to be fast, right? But I need to be competitive with what everything else is out there. So that when people are going, well, it's this much for this or this much for this, like, does it represent a reasonable value choice for the performance level that you get? Okay. Here's a slide that goes over one of the ways to look at competitive analysis, right? So core capabilities of those competitors. And that's not necessarily the thing that they're doing today. It's much broader, and it's more to do with, are they, really good at software development? Are they, really good at, building compelling, marketing programs? Are they great at designing products? Are they, things like that? Ability to grow, which has a lot to do with your access to capital, as well as other things, right? So often in growth, there's specialized talent and other people that you need to add to the organization. Can you tap into those things, and what does that look like? How can you respond quickly to things, or can you? Right, which has a lot to do with, if the organization is able to pivot. If they're not, and that's not an uncommon thing on some of the larger companies, it's one of the opportunities that smaller companies have, is that they can potentially pivot faster, take advantage of opportunities that perhaps the big ones just can't respond fast enough to. What's their ability to adopt and adapt to the change? And ultimately their staying power. And if you remember the 5 pieces in the strategy video, right, where they talk about what markets do we compete in, things like that. Well, one of the things they talk about is, what's our ability to continue to win with our customers over time, right? And that's that staying power. So all kinds of things, as I said, when you're doing your competitive analysis about the competitors themselves, and I've touched on most, if not all of these ones. And then I mentioned about benchmarking, which is specific measurements of things or performances that are important to your customers. It doesn't matter if it's important to you, it only matters if it's important to your customers. And it's how you rank versus other choices out there. Now, another piece is this concept of stakeholder analysis. So stakeholders are, individuals, groups, organizations. So customers, suppliers, shareholders, retirees, the communities that we operate in. There are these groups that have usually particular issues, priorities. There's things that make that bind them together that are common. And how they feel and respond and react to your organization and the things that you're doing can have a very pronounced effect on your ability to be successful. In fact, there's a lot of reason to believe that if you include these stakeholder voices in your planning cycle, and particularly if they're represented at potentially in an ownership fashion within the organization, that the organization may make better balanced decisions as a result of it, because all the voices are being heard within the organization during the planning cycle. And so that they're taking into account all of these perspectives, instead of it being one of the traditional issues with capitalism is that, capital is the owner of the financing and the resources for it. It's kind of like their view only seems to matter. And the truth is that's not the case. Everybody, there's all of these other stakeholders, their views matter. They're often not accommodated for in the initial planning, because they're just focused on what's good for whoever owns the company. And in fact, that's a crux of, if you were listening to the when Michael talked about the fourth option for kind of reforming and hopefully making capitalism work better. That's that fourth option that he talked about, was basically internalizing the stakeholders in the ownership structure and within the organization, so that they hopefully make better decisions. Technology. So I mentioned this before. So both the technologies that you use with the products that you make or the services that you create, as well as the technologies that are enabling technologies. So think of, video things that we can do so we can still communicate even though we're all locked up together and things like that. So you kind of have both of those. And usually with most businesses, both of them are in play, right? There's both changes to enabling technologies. There's also changes to the actual technologies of the products or services or the delivery of those things that they have. This is an interesting discussion piece if you think about it. So competitive technology can be a competitive advantage today and a constraint tomorrow, right? So that new order system that you put in place, is definitional for you today, but most systems, I mean, one of the challenges is that you have to recoup the investment that you've made on these technologies, which means you usually can't be swapping them out, very regularly all the time. So you have to kind of ride them for a reasonable length of time. And towards the end of the useful life of that system, it will be an impediment to you doing business, not the, not the game changer it was when you first brought it in. Oh, sorry. Click the wrong thing. And then internal capability analysis, right? So this is really about what can we do, which may be different than what we're doing today, right? So quick example. So locally, I think I've used these guys as an example before. Locally, a company called Inksmith, fairly small operation. We're basically using 3D printing technology to create learning tools for educators. I think they're primarily focused at primary. So I think there were a lot of like games and toys and things that they were created that were supposed to be used in learning environments. That was the core business. When the pandemic hit, a big run on all forms of PPE, they started using their 3D printers to 3D print masks. So like the clear plastic. And they recognized a huge opportunity. And in fact, they've created a product they call the Canadian Shield. I think they've actually broken it off as a separate division. They found, a space to increase their production. They've hired hundreds of people to be making them. They've gotten approved by Health Canada, so they're producing them domestically, but they're also looking at selling them, internationally as well. So they had a capability to design and produce flexibly because of the way they approach things with their 3D printing and stuff like that. They used to do it solely for these educational toys, but they actually had the ability to do this other thing now, which I think is going to prove to be probably a bigger thing for them, right, than the initial part of the business was that they started in. And you know what? I can think for all the years I worked at Research in Motion, which became BlackBerry, RIM was around for a long time before they launched BlackBerry, and they did all kinds of different things. But the thing that defined and really grew them to the size of the organization they ended up becoming was that pivot to the BlackBerry product. And when we pivoted over, it wasn't long before basically all the other product lines and all the other things we did kind of went by the wayside, and everything was focused on that one piece. So, because it took advantage of internal capabilities that we had, and it kind of overlaid on a market opportunity in that particular time. Now, when you're looking at what can I do but I'm not doing today, you do have to keep in mind. So I know one of the challenges we had as we were growing rapidly was, how do we tap into the people that we need with the skill sets that we need, right? Didn't take long before, we'd sucked most of Kitchener-Waterloo dry. And, then we were pulling people from Toronto, and then we were opening satellite offices in other places to try to tap into the people and the skill sets there. As we're growing facilities, equipment, things like that, money. Now, after the initial public offering, RIM had lots of money, so availability of funds wasn't an issue, but almost every business it usually is. And then adequate material supply, suppliers, all that other stuff, right? So you may come up with a, hey, we can do this and stuff like that, but you need to consider all those other things. Okay, where do we get the people? Where do we get the equipment? Can our suppliers keep up with the increase? Right? You want to consider all those things.